Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. All living things communicate, but human language is quite unique. Today, we learn about the cognitive, oral, and auditory apparatus that make language possible. Our guest is Philip Lieberman, a distinguished scientist in interdisciplinary research on language. Dr. Lieberman is the George Hazard Crooker University Professor Emeritus at Brown University. Before his retirement, he was Professor of Cognitive and Linguistic Sciences and also Professor of Anthropology at Brown University. He has received numerous honors, and he's known especially for establishing how the language apparatus evolved and how it functions. He's worked also on animal communication and on the issue of whether Neanderthal anatomy supported human-like communication. We're very honored to welcome Dr. Philip Lieberman. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
And Dr. Lieberman, I reached out to you specifically because I had seen a recent study in a prominent journal indicating that the auditory apparatus of Neanderthal was the equivalent of human, and therefore Neanderthal had human language. And I thought I'd ask you about this, I'd get a straight answer. But that was the reason. But I want to start this by asking you to explain what that apparatus, that language apparatus is, the cognitive, the oral, and the auditory. If you can do it in, a couple of minutes.
Oh, that paper is sort of a leap of faith. So chimpanzees can understand what people say.
Right. We'll come to that.
Yeah, and actually dogs can.
Right. But could you, one of the all-time experts on putting that, the brain, the oral, and the auditory apparatus that makes language possible?
But there's a number of factors. One, we have a specialized apparatus for talking. We have a brain that allows us to plan ahead. So one of the things that people don't realize is that before you make a sound, you planned out in your brain all of the motor commands to produce a sentence, complete thought. And that's before you've done a sound. So it's extremely complicated adjustments of the lungs, the larynx, muscles. You have about 20 or 30 muscles you have to control to do that. And people do that automatically without thinking, and no other animal can do that. And you have to not only be able to adjust these muscles and plan everything ahead, you have to relate it to a thought, to something abstract. So either something concrete like a chair or an apple. A lot of animals can do that, but to get things like honor or love, that's a tall order, and there's no indication that any other animal could do that. And that probably evolved gradually, it evolved gradually over the last 6 billion years in hominins. Hominins, archaic Neanderthals, are not like us, but they were pretty clever. And I think they have most of the characteristics that we do, but not all. It's sort of a gradual evolution, as Darwin pointed out. And it involves lots of factors, not just one.
Dr. Lieberman, you are an expert on the evolution of the speech anatomy, which is actually very complicated. So you've explained to us that you have to have a brain designed to anticipate what you want to say and be able to say more complex things. But the speech anatomy itself really evolved over our human history. Could you please tell us something about that and why that is so important?
Okay, first I start and tell you what speech anatomy is involved, and the easiest way most is the person who first discovered it. So about 1820, Johannes Müller in Germany took a larynx from a cadaver. He put it on a board with a hole under it and cleverly tensioned the muscles and we used the bellows to blow air through it. So it phonated and like that, okay? And the sound he heard was not speech, this is sort of buzz. So probably based on his knowledge of pipe organs, which have been around since ancient Greece, he put a tube on the top of it, the length of the airway from your larynx out to your lips, and it sounded like, and that was a source filter theory. In other words, the larynx is not the organ of speech. It provides energy that is then filtered by what we have sort of a variable organ pipe, and the frequencies at which maximum energy gets through this, like switching from one pipe to the other, determines the syllables, the consonants, the vowels of speech. Okay, so it's a very different system than and people who focus on the larynx say larynx is the organ of the voice box. It isn't, and this goes down to the present day. You have papers published on the brain control of the larynx is the key to speech. It isn't, because the larynx is only just one of structures that does it. In fact, people can talk without a larynx. You have people who have laryngectomies, and they can buy a device the telephone company used to give them away, which they put against their throat, and they can talk.
Okay, how about the tongue, the evolution of the tongue too? Is that an important part?
Oh yeah, the tongue is very, actually in 1859, Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species pointed out the peculiar human airway above the larynx, the tongue, which makes us more susceptible to choking to death on food. So choking to death on food is still the fourth leading cause of accidental death in the United States, even after the Heimlich maneuver. There are hundreds of examples of people choking or nearly choking to death. And that's because it was discovered that we have a strange airway where our face has changed over the last roughly 300,000 years, so that if you look at pictures of a baby when it's born doesn't look like a human. You have all these paintings, the Renaissance paintings, where they thought shrunken adults, they never look right. Babies have the anatomy of the face closer to a monkey so far as the vocal tract, and then gradually changes. So what happens is the mouth gets smaller and the tongue then moves down into the throat and way down. So our tongue is not here, it goes all the way down to here. And this gives us this funny kind of shape. And in 1972, Kenneth Stevens, who's a professor at MIT, discovered why we have this strange system. The human tongue, actually, this airway is called jargon, the supralaryngeal vocal tract, in other words, the airway above, allows us to produce sounds that make speech somewhat more intelligible. So you can talk without it, and Neanderthals talk without having a fully human speech, but it increases the intelligibility of speech and makes it less susceptible to error. So I'll give you an example. When we could produce things where Stevens called quantal sounds, the vowels E, A, and U, which occur in all human languages, they're sort of like saturated colors. They're equivalent of a saturated color. So we can talk using these sounds, and it's equivalent to a signal system with say pastel colors versus saturated colors. So this gives you an improvement, and it's not you could talk without it, but it gives you about maybe 10%, 15% better intelligibility. And you think, well, this is not important, but that's the way evolution works. Darwin stressed small differences drive evolution.
Right. How about the ear now? Can you tell us about that? In terms of being able to decipher?
That study is about the 10th of study I've seen over the years on Neanderthal ears. It's kind of funny.
And people do get on about it.
The authors actually got a different result than a study they did about 5 years ago on the same fossils. But it's kind of not very, very important. The ear, you can, first of all, they concentrate on consonants. And one of the things we'll get to, consonants don't exist in isolation. And when you talk, what you're producing is a syllable, and you can't even say a sound like the T. You could look at the word of T without saying a vowel. T, to, impossible to do it. And the acoustic signal that signals the T is the same, is put on a vowel. And in fact, you plan ahead. So you can look in a mirror, a very simple thing, it is part of encoding. If you look in a mirror and look at yourself saying to, you'll see you push your lips forward for the ooh that is going to occur after the supposed T, before, at the moment you're producing it, versus T, to, T. So you can't get an isolated kind of T, and they don't realize that the consonants are put on the vowels, and the paper is sort of, it's kind of not terribly relevant.
Right. Well, all of these things, it's important to have the right anatomy in order to develop human language. On the other hand, we also, I hope that we've got enough about the anatomy in there for vocalizing and processing language, but we have sign language as well. So you can learn language and you can translate spoken and sign language, but you need that cognitive apparatus to develop language, correct?
Yeah, well, sign language is kind of, first of all, sign language didn't exist until about the 18th century. It was invented. Writing didn't exist until about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So spoken language is the medium of language, and in fact,
absolutely,
and it still is. My wife and I have gone to parts of the world in the Himalaya where practically no one is literate, and they have language. And
that's exactly right. That's exactly
complicated cultures. And,
yes. Now, but you can develop these alternative means to communicate at a human level, which is my point. Then I want to go on to like animal communications. It seems that there is a great emphasis these days on animal communication, much more understanding of this, certainly more appreciation for it, but that there is a tendency to conflate animal communication with human language. I want your view on that, if I may.
Okay, animals, that gets very interesting because actually it gets into this question of the brain. So you can't talk about language without brains, which we'll get to. But animals, for example, chimpanzees, if the gardeners and Sue Savage and worked with more soothsayers, worked with bonobos. The gardeners worked with
Right.
chimpanzees.
Yeah.
The
Right.
Niles worked with the orangutan. If you take an ape and raise it as a child from birth, it will the ape will pick up about, if you're using manual language, sign language, or computer keyboard, it will learn about 150 words.
That's words.
It will make up words. It'll understand.
Yes. Right.
And they
Right.
understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And they'll communicate from one to another. So it was an experiment. The gardeners had a washoe. Their first chimpanzee had an infant. The infant died. They got Lulis, another infant, to place with her, and she was grieving for about a week or two. But then they raised Lulis, and they decided to say, could Lulis learn sign language from other chimpanzees without any humans? So they had 5 chimpanzees who used sign language to communicate. So for a year, no human signed to the language. They just spoke to them in English. The chimpanzees understood what they're saying. They don't know quite exactly what they understood. But Lulis learned about, again, 100 words of sign language from other chimpanzees. So they have this latent capacity, and it depends on the culture. If you take a human and put them in isolation, they're not going to learn language either. A few cases like Genie.
Of course. Right.
And the problem we have in zoos, I worked in and analyzed chimpanzees in zoos in 1968. And these animals in a zoo are not equivalent to their culture. They're removed from their natural environment.
Right.
And to be quite frank, we do not know at this moment what chimpanzees actually communicate to each other in the natural state. So Jane Goodall, for example, documented very complex relations of chimpanzees and zombie. They made what are called follow films. People, trackers follow them all the time. And after a while, I worked as a photographer too, those are parallel. And if you're working, taking pictures of someone, if you just keep taking pictures, eventually they'll ignore you. This is a fly on the wall. And the chimpanzees annoyed, just ignored the trackers. And you could look at these follow films, and no one has ever analyzed them. And it's kind of a shame. About 20 years ago, I and Chris Bohm, who's an anthropologist, said, let's analyze that. The linguists on the NSF panel refused to fund the analysis because it animals have no language.
I don't want to get too far off track here. I just want to get clear.
Well,
there can be
so animals have some components of language, and they can understand you. Horses can clearly.
Many animals,
and they can communicate to you. The chimpanzees using sign language could communicate what they wanted. They could refer to past events. Washer was frightened by a dog and would always assign people keep the dogs away. She made up a new word at a birthday party for her. She was about her person working with gave her some cake, and then she wanted more cake, and he said no cake, and she signed to him Dirty Roger.
Okay. In these, they're clever in this way. Birds can do this too. The kinds of, but they're more immediate communications. That sort. Let me go on here because I gotta get more on the animal communication.
Sure.
There are many animals that have quite sophisticated forms of communication. We don't usually confuse that with like human language, but much is being made of this. The ability to understand human words, the ability to sort of create little words and so on. There is another example of birds, so a number of birds like parrots, for example, do not have our speech anatomy. They can produce better than any other animal that I know of, the human words and phrases. I don't think they have a clue what they're saying, but in other words, we don't confuse that with having acquired language. No. So their own communication systems can be complex also.
Actually, yeah, birds,
a different anatomy.
Yeah, birds are using an entirely different system. What they're doing is they have two devices called pharynx.
Yeah.
Pharynx puts out a pure tone, and they're very clever. They put the pure tone at the place where you have maximum energy for human speech. So it's a pure tone speech, and there've been some groups of artists have actually made sine wave speech for artistic purposes. There's a group called the Pulsar Group in New York, Whitney Museum. So the birds can imitate sound. And in fact, this 1968 study of chimpanzees in the zoos, I nearly had a lot of trouble because it was a minor bird, was in the primate house for the zoo winter, and the minor bird was imitating the chimpanzee.
Yeah, they can.
And it took myself and Franklin Cooper, who was director of Haskins Lab and expert, weeks to figure out get rid of the minor bird.
Yeah. They do pick it up, but some of these birds, it may be the minor that can actually imitate machines, like in forests when they're cutting down trees and that sort of thing. They're just astounding. But the point there is that you could have a different anatomy and produce speech sounds, but we don't say that the parrots or the minors have human language. The other one there is to about the anatomy for the cognitive apparatus. You're familiar probably with the, Irene Pepperberg's famous parrot. Right. They are, yeah. And they can do all sorts of things. They have quite good cognitive ability, but we don't confuse that with the human capacity.
Yeah, it's limited. And actually, it's about the last 40 years, I've been more concerned, equally concerned, say, more with the brain.
Right.
So we did a lot of work on Parkinson's disease.
Yes, yeah.
I just do. And the reason you look at these cases of anomalies and diseases, that you can't do an experiment like cutting out part of someone's brain to see.
Yes. Yeah. So right.
You have to do what's called an experiment in nature, where ethically some damages occur, and then see what's happened. The other way, part of the coin, is in genetics, and there've been amazing strides in that. So if one of the things that people talk about, the vaccines now that use RNA. Okay.
Yes, the mRNA.
And that's quite, the way it works, the DNA, you have DNA codes genes, but genes don't translate into parts of the body or brain. The genes have to be rewritten, transcribed into RNA, and then the RNA goes more complicated processes into eventually making a brain, a body. Okay, one of the things is a transcription factor that does this is called FOXP2.
Yes.
FOXP2.
And there are variants there, right?
Yeah, FOXP2 in Neanderthals and humans, and denosivans, sort of like Neanderthals, is different from chimpanzees. And in about 1990s, they found a family in London.
Yes.
Was found who couldn't talk. In fact, I got very interested because at the time, my wife and I were quite involved with a young girl who was having trouble talking, and it turned out to be similar brain damage. It was found out that this transcription factor, FOXP2, in this family was defective. They had only one copy. Okay, they then, in the Max Planck Institute, were able to pull out DNA from fossils that Neanderthals and human ancestors maybe 40,000, 50,000 years ago. And they found the farmer FOXP2 in humans is different from chimpanzees. Okay, if you took that FOXP2, you put it into an embryo, like techniques they use for GMO food, what happens is that the mechanisms of the brain that allow you to learn new information, synaptic modification, change. So in the basal ganglia, these parts of the brain, deep in the brain, which go back 500 million years, and 500 million years, not 5 years, to animals like lampreys, those you find them never went away. And you added parts of the brain to them, cortex in humans. In birds, there's another structure that is sort of similar to the cortex added to that basal gang. And there is no one part of the brain that in itself is the seat of language. You have a number of structures all working together. So in Parkinson's disease, the basal ganglia deteriorate and you start seeing problems with language and thinking and motor control because they're all related.
Right. You've done all that work on the basal ganglia and the coordination aspects of putting language together, and that language, producing language and perhaps comprehending language, but producing in particular requires a great deal of coordination, very fine coordination. I know that we do not have a whole lot of time left, and I want to ask you about this Neanderthal question as well. Dr. Lieberman, some years ago, I think you wrote in one article that the earliest humans and also Neanderthal did not have that language equipment. But then recently, everybody seems to think that Neanderthals do have language.
Well, actually, the paper we published at Pearl in 1971 concluded the last paragraph stated that Neanderthals talked and had language. And what's happened is that there's been sort of a alternate science going on here.
I don't know. I have a direct quote. So from the paper.
That's a direct quote, and I can give you some of the paper. The paper concludes Neanderthal speech was not as clear as ours, but at that time the archaeological record suggested that they had the cognitive ability and they made tools
Okay.
That are impossible to make without language. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what's happened since then, the genetic studies like FOXP2 showed that indicate that Neanderthals had brains that are not that far removed from human brains in their cognitive ability.
So you would say that Neanderthal had language equivalent. There's no question about communication. The question is, did they make that leap to the equivalent of human language?
Neanderthals clearly had complex language.
Okay.
Pretty close to human language.
All right.
They survived in they didn't have traces of art. No one has yet found any art from Neanderthals.
Exactly.
But they're pretty, and they mated with humans. They lived they survived for at least 300,000 years.
Yeah.
So what's happened is that people keep there's been a tendency in science and other things, people kind of posturing and reinventing things. So the Neanderthal paper was very clear. It has been misrepresented in a couple of recent paper, turning the result upside down. We stated that Neanderthals had, it wasn't, their speech was not as clear, but it's clear they had language, period. They had not, and this gets back to Charles Darwin, it's not a question of language or not language, it had to gradually evolve. And it's becoming clear from looking at the archaeological record that the ability to make complex stone tools, which no chimpanzee could make, for example, goes back maybe 2.2, maybe almost 3 million years ago, where you don't have it way before Neanderthals or Homo erectus into animals like some of the Australopithecines. So language evolved gradually in stages together with cognitive ability and together with things like opposable thumbs, so you could use it in upright posture. They're all connected. So,
okay. All right. Before we finish, I'm going to ask a couple of things about the animal, the record, the actual physical record. I understand, and I'll let you address that. The quality and the amount of physical fossil record for things like Neanderthal is a little, it's not very extensive, I understand, or not very good. However, there are just a couple of recent studies. They're now reconstructing the DNA from using dust or dirt from caves to reconstruct. So maybe they will be able to put a more developed anatomical record out there for us eventually. But in the meantime, there are all of these studies that say, like, in a sense, like you just did, well, they used tools and they decorated and that sort of thing. And I have personally been confused by that because I have long lists of animals that use tools. They don't have opposable thumbs, and chimpanzees do not make the kinds of shelters that a lot of birds are able to make that are much more complicated. And so animals use tools, they fashion tools. Chimpanzees certainly use tools. Again, I bring up that a recent documentary showing that since Neanderthals ran with these long poles and thrusted them, that proves that they were like humans. But
okay.
Chimpanzees do this,
okay.
So that's the problem.
Let me give you a cognitive example. Okay, Neanderthals and earlier hominins use a technique where it's like baking a cake. So baking a cake, you take a whole bunch of you take flour, sugar, milk, you stir it around, you get a big paste, okay? Doesn't look at all like a cake. Then you change the direction of what you're doing, put it in an oven, bake it. There's a disjuncture, a cognitive disjuncture.
Yes.
Okay. Neanderthals and humans and earlier humans use a similar technique to make stone tools. Now, no chimpanzee has ever made a stone cutting tool on its own. Ever. There's no record. They use tools, they'll store tools. Chimpanzees actually have used stones to hammer nuts open, and they have stored them for thousands of years, it turns out, in the Thai region of Africa, but they don't make tools. So the technique that Neanderthals used and other humans, you make was first called a Valvasian technique. It's the change. John Shea, who's an expert on stone tools, has tracked it back to way before Neanderthals. You take a stone and you make that looks like a turtle. Doesn't look like any tool.
Yes.
Then you shift and you take a hit it hard, or push on it, and out pops a complete cutting edge. Take another one, another one. This is a technique that was used to make the flints in the Napoleonic Wars with muskets, and it's still used by diamond cutters, for example, today.
Okay, so
no animal has done that, and that's a cognitive jump.
Okay.
which you can see in Neanderthals and Homo erectus, and you
Okay.
don't see it in animal.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. And then also to close, can you give us your definition of language in this case? So Neanderthal had what it may have not have been as refined as obviously because cultures were not that refined, but you're saying that the language capacity was there for them. There's some little bit of not fuzzy, it's a little fuzzy on animal communication. What then is language?
Well, language is the ability to communicate all of the information of a culture, concepts, and indicate new information and transmit new concepts from one generation to the next, from one individual to the next. And that's what language does. You have it's open, it's an open set. So animals, a lot of animal communication is genetically determined. There's alarm cries. When they can adapt an alarm cry to another threat, so they can, from a bird to a drone, for example, but they can't jump to a new concept. Okay, the parts of the brain, this basal ganglia, cortex, the basal ganglia, if that degenerates in conditions like Parkinson's and other cases, what people lose is not only ability to understand language, they lose the ability to change the direction of the thought process. There's creativity, and that's wrapped up with language inextricably. So language is both the ability to communicate and the brain mechanisms that allow you to plan ahead and understand sentences are also involved in adapting to new circumstances. So we did this experiment on Mount Everest, which seems off the wall, but it wasn't. We found that as the brain deteriorated, these sort of circuits began because of lack of oxygen, people's inability to understand sentences deteriorated, but what also deteriorated, ability to change the direction of a thought of what they were doing. So the disasters on Mount Everest were that because people started up to climb, the weather conditions changed, and instead of doing what they would normally do, go back, they persisted in what they were doing. So this is this kind of cognitive inflexibility wrapped up with same brain mechanisms, and they're related to motor control too. So motor control deteriorates, like Parkinson's disease. See, motor control deteriorates, language deteriorates, and unfortunately, cognition deteriorates too.
Right, right. I am sorry, we are out of time here. Before we close, I was hoping to talk about some of your books, and especially maybe the one, The Theory That Changed Everything, on Darwin. That was a very nice book. You've written a lot of books, and so I'd urge people have a look at this production because they're very readable. A lot of these books are very readable as well. You've done a remarkable job of communicating with the public and reaching out to the public, and I appreciate it very much. Dr. Lieberman, thanks so much for being with us today.
And thank you.